Good afternoon. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to welcome you this afternoon to the William G. McGowan Theater here at the National Archives, whether you're here in person or joining us on our YouTube channel. I'm glad you could be with us. Before we hear from Sean Wilentz about his new book, No Property in Man, Slavery and Anti-Slavery at the Nation's Founding, I'd like to tell you about two other programs coming up within the next week. On Friday, September 14th, in collaboration with the Assembly for Democracy in Vietnam, we'll host a day-long symposium called The Vietnam War Revisited, which will explore the Vietnam War from the Vietnamese perspective. Then next Tuesday, September 18th, at noon, Kyle Longley, the newly appointed director of the Lyndon B. Johnson Presidential Library, will be here to talk about his latest book, LBJ's 1968, Power, Politics, and the Presidency in America's Year of Upheaval. Check our website, archives.gov, to learn more about all of our programs, and there's a sign-up sheet at the table outside the theater to get email updates. Another way to get more involved in with the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. The foundation supports our education and outreach programs, and you can learn more about their work at their website, archivesfoundation.org, and join online. The word slavery doesn't appear in the United States Constitution passed by the delegates to the Constitutional Convention in 1787. Its first and only appearance is in the article that abolished the institution, the 13th Amendment, passed in 1865. The text written by the delegates in 1787 refers to other persons, such persons, or a person held to service or labor. The question of slavery, however, loomed large over the convention. In No Property in Man, Sean Wilentz re-examines the debate over slavery and shines a light on the paradox of slavery and freedom written into the Constitution. The original signed Constitution is one of the three prized founding documents on permanent display upstairs in the rotunda. Even though copies of the text are readily available in print and online, more than 1 million visitors a year line up to see the original in person. As we gaze at the enshrined parchment, we may need a reminder now and then that the road to creating this revered foundational document was not an easy one. Professor Wilentz shows us the arguments and compromises of the Constitutional Convention and the roots of the struggle over slavery through the end of the Civil War. Sean Wilentz is the George Henry Davis 1886 Professor of American History at Princeton University. Many of his works have won national prizes. The Rise of American Democracy, Jefferson to Lincoln, received the prestigious Bancroft Prize and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Professor Wilentz's latest book, No Property in Man, is based on his Nathan I. Huggins lectures at Harvard in 2015. He has also written extensively on the American popular music. His Bob Dylan in America was a New York Times bestseller, and 360 Sound, the Columbia record story, was nominated for a Grammy and won other national awards. He lectures frequently and has written some 300 articles, reviews, and op-ed pieces for national and international publications. But his greatest credential, as far as I'm concerned, is that Sean was a fellow at the Cullman Center for Writers and Scholars at the New York Public Library when I was the director there. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sean Wilentz.
Well, it's great to see you all here. Thank you, David, for that lovely introduction. It's a somber day, September 11th. I should note that. And get going with today's lecture based on a new book of mine. As David said, I decided to write about the Constitution and slavery, and I have come up with, I think, a basic reevaluation of the subject, a basic reevaluation of slavery and the Constitution, which I think is, there is no more essential or urgent topic in all of American history. If we understand the relationship between slavery and the Constitution correctly, we're getting America correctly. If we don't, we're not. For the past 40 years, historians have largely argued that the Constitution, the revered document out there, basically enshrines slavery, making the Constitution itself, for all of its glories, worthy of condemnation as a diabolical covenant with death. That's what historians have generally been arguing over the last 40 years, and it's kind of become an orthodoxy among us, or at least my colleagues, and among constitutional scholars as well, or at least many of them. That interpretation arose out of a great re-examination of all of American history, putting slavery back in the center of our understanding of American history, and it did a great deal of good, I think. It ended the evasion over the question of slavery in the Constitution. Scholars had evaded it for decades. It showed the importance of slavery at the Constitutional Convention and the sway that the slaveholders held at that convention. It undid the idea that the Constitution was somehow neutral over slavery, let alone the idea that the Constitution was an anti-slavery, fundamentally anti-slavery document. So that's all been to the good, but I think that the record shows that that interpretation is in need of some amendment. The argument, I think, has misconstrued some very important debates within the Constitutional Convention. It's minimized the effect of anti-slavery politics on the framers, and it's missed a crucial subtlety. I don't really need these. It's missed a crucial subtlety, which is this. There were many concessions made to the slaveholders and the slaveholding states at the convention, but with all of those concessions, the majority of the convention deliberately refused to recognize slavery's legitimacy by refusing to acknowledge the cornerstone of slavery's legality. What had become what always was the cornerstone of its legality, but it had become more and more a contested issue, and that is the legitimacy of property in man. I mean, slavery is about a lot of things, but fundamentally it's about the right of one person to own another as chattel. That's its fundament. If the Constitution was to recognize and acknowledge the legitimacy of that institution, then American history was going to go in one direction. If it did not, however, it would go in a different direction, and I submit that it did not. The framers, as they gathered in Philadelphia in 1787, understood that it would be necessary to tolerate slavery as a local institution, as an institution where it already existed. The Constitution, the framers would limit the powers of the states in various ways, barring them from coining money or from imposing tariffs. But they would not interfere in the established property laws of the southern states any more than they would those of the northern states. It wasn't going to happen. You weren't going to have a bunch of delegates in Philadelphia rewriting the property laws of any of the individual states that already existed. But neither would they recognize slaves as property. To have done so would have repudiated the radical belief that was increasingly forceful in the North that debasing humans into property violated the fundamental principles of the Revolution itself. It would have affirmed the idea that the slaveholders obtained their property in human beings legally, and that their rights to that property were therefore inviolable. Above all, it would have rendered the federal government absolutely powerless to limit the expansion of slavery in any way at all, especially to limit its expansion into areas under its own jurisdiction. Tolerated where it exists, but would it be tolerated in places where the federal government held sway? This the convention refused to do. As the Massachusetts delegate Elbridge Gerry said at the convention, the Constitution should have, quote, nothing to do with the conduct of the states as to slaves, but ought to be careful not to give any sanction to it. Now, this might appear to be a distinction without a difference, right? I mean, isn't tolerating the existence of slavery the same thing as enshrining it? No, it's not. It's different, because under one set of circumstances, slavery is a local institution, which could be gotten rid of either by the states themselves or could be limited by the federal government. In the other case, it could not. And the framers made very clear that they were not going to allow property in man to become a national institution. As a result, the federal government, as stated by the Constitution, did have that power. First, by authorizing the Congress, the national government, the Congress, to abolish the Atlantic slave trade, which the Constitution does do, even with a delay, and then with Congress's power over the territories. Had the framers failed to do this, exclude property in man, nothing could have been done to halt slavery's growth. But they did do it, and that had monumental consequences. And that's basically the argument of this book. One way to get a handle on all of this, there's a lot of technical fine points here. I want to dispense with those today, but one way to get a handle on it is to return to the politics of slavery in the years leading to the Civil War. And those politics, I think, have endured to this day. We're still fighting the Civil War in many ways. In the 1830s and 1840s, a radical immediatist abolitionist movement arose, led by William Lloyd Garrison, which came to behold the Constitution as a thoroughly pro-slavery document. A covenant with death was how Garrison put it. And this has become the prevailing view among historians and many, if not most, constitutional experts. Somewhat ironically, it was identical to the view held by John C. Calhoun and by Roger Brooke Tawney and by Jefferson Davis. But there was another view, advanced by, among others, Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. Now, in developing the idea that the Constitution was, in Frederick Douglass's words, a glorious freedom document, I think they went too far. But their key point was that the framers had deliberately excluded the very idea of property in man from national law, thereby giving the federal government the power to contain it, in order to put it, as Lincoln said, in the course of ultimate extinction. It was that argument, more than any, that inflamed the political and constitutional crisis that led to the Republican Party, the election of Abraham Lincoln to the presidency, followed by Southern secession, Civil War, and emancipation. It's that important. And upon close examination of the records of the Federal Convention in 1787 and subsequent debates, it is this view, the view of Lincoln and Douglass, I believe, which emerges as the most accurate. Lincoln and Douglass were right, basically, not on everything, but basically, Garrison and Calhoun were wrong. Historians have tended to regard Lincoln's and Douglass's interpretation as a praiseworthy but somewhat willful misreading of the Constitution and the records surrounding the Constitution's framing and ratification. But a rereading of those sources, especially Madison's notes, shows, I believe, incontrovertibly, that Lincoln and Douglass were correct about the crucial matter, the exclusion of property in man, and hence came closer to what the framers had done than either William Lloyd Garrison or John C. Calhoun. This is not just an academic fine point. And this is not just a quibble among historians or constitutional experts. For an understanding why Lincoln and Douglass were correct, the political and constitutional history of slavery from the Revolution to the Civil War looks profoundly different than it does now. It allows us to see more clearly than ever that the matter of property in man and its constitutional status was the central perennial question in the momentous political and legal struggle over slavery that led to the Civil War and finally to emancipation. Okay. So how did I come upon this? What led me here? Why am I writing about all of this? I have to thank, I suppose, or maybe to blame, depending on how you think about my talk, I have to blame Henry Louis Gates up at Harvard, an old friend, who invited me to give the very prestigious Nathan Huggins lectures up at Harvard some years ago. At the time, Skip Gates and I were having a wonderful argument about Thomas Jefferson and slavery. And we went into print, you know, and we're good friends. It was a lot of fun. And he wanted me to come talk about Thomas Jefferson. But I'd already written about Thomas Jefferson. I didn't want to repeat myself and say all the things once again that I'd said about Thomas Jefferson and slavery. And a lot has been written about it. And I didn't want to go where everybody else was. When that invitation came from Professor Gates in 2013, I'd actually been writing a great deal, as David said, about modern American music and cultural history, particularly on Bob Dylan and then on Columbia Records, which is fine, except that the Huggins lectures are all about African American history. So I had to come up with something to write about, or lecture about. And I thought I might talk about the blues or talk about gospel. I actually had a series of lectures drafted on Blythe and Willie Johnson, who's a really important figure, who I hope I get to later on. But just at that point, Civil War historians and historians of emancipation began focusing on the property issue, the importance of property in the deliberations of the Congress, in Lincoln's thinking and so forth, in the whole crisis of the Civil War itself. The property question was looming larger than ever. It was then also that I remembered a line, when I was writing a book called The Rise of American Democracy some 15 years ago. A line came out of me from Madison's records, from Madison himself, James Madison from Virginia at the Constitutional Convention, saying that the Constitution should not admit the idea that there could be property in men. Now, as David said, the word slavery does not appear in the Constitution of the United States. That's what Madison seemed to be talking about. And most historians argue to that point, and still argue, that excluding the word slavery was just a subterfuge. It was just an evasion. It was a way to calm guilty consciences. It was a way maybe to gain more support in the North from anti-slavery people, get them to support the Constitution, which was by no means an obvious thing that was going to happen. To gain more support from abroad as well. I mean, plenty of, let alone the British after the Revolution, many people were saying, how can these Americans stand for liberty and freedom when they have slaves? So the argument has been that there was this great kind of circumlocution. They found all kinds of words to use instead of slavery, but bringing slavery into the Constitution, indeed enshrining slavery in the Constitution without actually using the word slavery. It was a great bait and switch, or a great, a lie. A lie was supposedly at the heart of the Constitutional Convention and slavery. Or if not, a lie, then a rather monumental act of dissembling. And that's what the argument has been. They would not use the word slavery, but they would admit the thing into the Constitution, and indeed even enshrine the thing in the Constitution. Having a pro-slavery Constitution that never once mentioned slavery. But Madison's words were somewhat different. It was not just that we should not admit the word slavery. We should not admit the very idea that there could be property in men. That's somewhat different. That's not just the word, that's the thing. And it somewhat bothered me, actually, when I was writing that. But, well, historians say one thing, but Madison seemed to be saying something else. So I thought I'd go back and see what the framers actually said. This is figuring out, what am I going to do for these lectures? So I said, well, that's a question. I'm going to try to figure that one out. And I went back and looked through all the records that surround the Constitutional Convention, which are not that many, actually. But they're enough to keep me busy for a while, at least to get a lecture together. And I saw, once I started reading those closely, it was pretty eye-opening. This hasn't happened to us historians all that much. When you look up, people have been looking at these records for forever. And they were published in 1840, Madison's records, and people have been looking at it forever. And so it's not that often you look at something that generations have looked at and see something new. Maybe it was psychedelic, but I thought I saw something new. And then, even more, I saw that thing running all through the key episodes that led to the Civil War, from the 1790s all the way through the crisis over Missouri, over the gag rule debates, on through the sectional crack-up of the 1850s. I began to feel a little bit as I imagined Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes must have felt, as he fastened on the dog that didn't bark. The fact that the framers did not recognize property in man was looking to me to be the crucial clue to the confounding ambiguities and mysteries of the founding and slavery. And once that clue was cracked, the entire history of what followed looked very different. And therefore, the whole history of the United States began to look very different, at least to me. in my study. So I got really excited. And I delivered the lectures up at Harvard. And they seemed to go over pretty well. So I wrote some more lectures and did some writings, including a brief and very pointed op-ed in the New York Times, which appeared about 3 years ago. Well, that op-ed did not please everybody in my corner of the scholarly world. And not just in that corner of the scholarly world. Bucking the neo-Garrisonian orthodoxy about the pro-slavery Constitution prompted some pretty intense, indeed, at times, hostile responses, and not just from my respected colleagues. An NPR host, the wait, wait, don't tell me guy, I forget his name, he wrote to the New York Times telling me I was full of it. I couldn't be right. People said it was comic gold, this piece of mine. Now, some of this was unfortunate because it arose from a basic misreading of what I was saying, claiming that I was saying that the Constitution was a wholly anti-slavery document, and that's not my point at all. But those kinds of misreadings usually come in defenses of what have become brittle and even calcified orthodoxies. You're going to get that misreading when people think they know what you're talking about, but they're not really getting what you're talking about because they're defending something that has become so much a part of their souls, their academic souls, their intellectual souls. I can't be right. Well, so they misread it. Anyhow, I knew I was right, or at least was right about what really mattered. And so I spent the next couple of years refining the argument and extending it to cover the entire period from 1787 to 1865. And this book, and I'll hold it up just because I am on book tour, this book is the result. And I'm eager, now that it's out, I'm eager to pick up the debate where it left off. I hope with a little bit less rancor, but we can have the debate, and I'm looking forward to it. And today is the day that I begin doing all of that. Okay. So to understand the issue, I think we need some context about the time of the founding of the nation, time of the Constitutional Convention. And two things are really important to bear in mind as context. First, anti-slavery was a fairly new thing. Well, at least anti-slavery among white people. Among slaves and black people, anti-slavery was there from the start. But among non-slaves, anti-slavery was a pretty new thing. For millennia, the history of slavery goes back to antiquity. Slavery, even where there wasn't slavery in medieval Europe, they were still writing laws as if there was. The framework was very much the same, understanding property and so forth. Anti-slavery was a new thing. Before the 1750s, there was very little objection to slavery among whites. The Quakers had been objecting to slavery somewhat from the end of the 17th century, but it took them 50 years to actually renounce the institution. Not until the 1750s are the Quakers actually asking people, telling people to stop owning slaves. But a great moral reversal really did occur in the middle of the 18th century. It's really, I think, in many ways, the greatest revolutionary development in modern history. And that is, in terms of political events, a great moral reversal fed by evangelical religion, but also fed by the Enlightenment, that held slavery to be now immoral, ungodly, sinful, or, for the Enlightenment, a fundamental violation of natural rights. This only developed. There were antecedents in the 17th century, but it really gets going from around 1750 to around 1770. There is this explosion out there. And the foundation of America, the American Revolution, was very much a part of that. Not that the American Revolution was an anti-slavery revolution by any means. But the forces that were leading Americans to rebel, to overthrow monarchy, were arising parallel to this anti-slavery moment. The two were going on together, and in certain places they overlapped. Pushed by rebellions and courtroom actions of slaves and free blacks, but it was very much there. People are somewhat surprised when I tell them this, remind them of this, but the very first anti-slavery society in the history of the world was founded in Philadelphia in 1775, about 5 days before Lexington and Concord. The organized anti-slavery politics originated in America. But we should know, therefore, that anti-slavery politics was something very new in 1787. It wasn't something that was lying around waiting. It wasn't so much that anti-slavery people were so strong and so powerful and had been around for a long time and the Constitution ignored them. It was a new thing, at least among white people. It was a new thing. Well, that's point number one. Point number two is that it was making very real progress by 1787. Not around the entire emerging new country, but in the North. In the North, remember, in 1776, slavery was an institution in all the 13 colonies. Slavery was not a Southern institution, it was a national institution. Not that there was a constitution to say that it was so, but every state had laws that ratified or legitimized property in man, making slaves conveyable chattel just like animals. That was true everywhere in the United States. But between 1780 and 1787, in 5 of the new states and in one state to be, Vermont, the Patriots either repudiated the principle of property in man or undermined it by abolishing slavery outright or by putting it on the road to extinction. It's extraordinary. I mean, quite apart from what the British might have done during the Revolution, it was the largest legal emancipation by legislatures or courts in modern history to that time was occurring in the North on the eve of the Constitutional Convention in 1787. And it wasn't easy. It wasn't as if the Northerners just said, oh yeah, let's get rid of this slavery thing. It's not so central to our economy. Who needs it? We don't like it. There were really hard fights in the northern states over emancipation. And it led to compromised victories in many places, not so much in northern New England, but certainly in Pennsylvania and in Connecticut and Rhode Island and later in New York and New Jersey. Gradual emancipation didn't free any slaves, actually. It freed the children of slaves. People were going to be slaves. There were slaves in New Jersey as late as 1865. Not a lot, but a few, because of the process of gradual emancipation. Nevertheless, given where the larger world galactic history of slavery, it was an enormous break with the past. The victory was perfectly clear. Courts and legislatures did have the authority to declare an entire class of property illegitimate. That's about as revolutionary as you come, isn't it? Getting rid of not just saying, I'm going to take your house, eminent domain, but saying an entire class of property, it's illegitimate. It's either doesn't exist anymore right now, or it's not going to exist down the line. That is an extraordinary act, given how powerful slavery had been for so long. And here was the heart of the issue. In those northern battles over emancipation, racist defenses of slavery certainly came into play. There was no shortage of pro-slavery people saying, black people are inferior, we can't have them free, they're going to make our society terrible. No, no, no. Racism was certainly there, although it was not quite as deeply obsessive and weird as it would become in the 19th century, and we all know about that. But it was there. There were also appeals to the Bible. There are always appeals to the Bible on slavery, on both sides. So there were appeals to the Bible, Leviticus, you find evidence of slavery. Christ ran through, he never said a single anti-slavery thing, all that stuff. Talk about the Sermon on the Mount, but that's another matter. But first and foremost, the defense by the slaveholders of slavery in the North turned on a defense of the bedrock principle of property. It was all about property. That property in man was a natural right that could not be abrogated, could not be violated. That's what they said. And they fought very hard on that, and that is precisely what the Northern emancipationists did. They violated that idea that property in man was a natural right. Overthrowing that idea attacked the very cornerstone of slavery. the legal cornerstone of slavery. If owning another person is not legitimate, well, then how can you have slavery? Slavery depended upon the assumption of that legitimacy. And one northern state after another, in very compromised ways to be sure, but one northern state after another undid that idea. It was a pretty radical blow, looking back on it. It wasn't nirvana for the slaves by any means. But legally, and given the history of property, it was a major break with the past. So those 2 points have to be borne in mind if we're going to understand what happened in 1787. That was the context. Because the Northerners were fighting over all of this, and they were increasingly the emancipationists who were winning, Southern slaveholders took notice. They saw what was going on. Indeed, the upsurge had touched as far south as Virginia, where there was an argument over emancipation in 1785. And indeed, the property argument won out. There was a little bit of the racist stuff, there was a little bit of the Bible, not much Bible stuff at all. But on the issue of property, the Virginians held firm, and they did not go for gradual emancipation in 1785. But it had come up. That was scary to a lot of Southerners. The framers were gathered in Philadelphia, after all, to form a stronger central government. That was the idea, right? Remember, the Articles of Confederation, our first Constitution, there was virtually no central government at all. The whole point was to construct a stronger one, which presented both an opportunity and a potential threat to the slaveholders. They wanted greater order to commerce, greater order to national defense. These are things they agreed about with their northern fellow delegates. So we needed to strengthen the government. But a stronger central government now presented a possibility of a government strong enough to overthrow, or at least to constrain, property rights in man, which is what was going on in the North. Indeed, they were meeting in Philadelphia, the headquarters of Northern anti-slavery. So they're coming to the convention saying, well, we want a strong government, but we're going to do everything we can to make sure that that government could do nothing to affect slavery. And they had that very much in mind. They weren't wrong to worry, as there were Northerners who were just as determined to limit slavery. In fact, a large number of the Northern delegates to the Constitutional Convention, including Benjamin Franklin, were active anti-slavery, active members of the early anti-slavery societies. Benjamin Franklin, in fact, was president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society in 1787. So the Southerners were right to be worried. They were going to try to limit slavery as best they could. They were not going to interfere with slavery where it existed. That wasn't going to happen. That just wasn't going to happen. But they could use the power of the new federal government or design the new federal government in ways that could potentially curb slavery's growth. And the belief was if you constrain slavery's growth, then you put slavery on the road to extinction. Chiefly, they would push for giving the federal government the authority to abolish the Atlantic slave trade. Now, at this point in the history of slavery, it's important. To abolish the Atlantic slave trade, people believed was the first step towards abolishing slavery. This is before the Cotton Revolution. This is before all the things that were going to transform slavery in the 19th century. At that point, that was thought to be the vital first step. And there were plenty of Northerners going to that convention who wanted to make sure that the federal government would have the power to do so, regardless of what the Southerners may have wanted. But they would also make sure that even if they had to tolerate slavery in South Carolina, they weren't going to be able to get rid of it in South Carolina. They would not enshrine property in man in national law. They would not make the principle of property in man a feature of the new nation. Well, Southerners had different ideas in mind, and so the battle was joined. That confrontation is at the very heart of this new book of mine. That's at the heart of No Property in Man. How those battles unfolded in Philadelphia, above all, there's a long chapter about all of that, and I concentrate on the three basic compromises over slavery that occurred at the Constitutional Convention, and then one less than famous anti-slavery victory at the convention. How did it all unfold? Well, to try to be concise, there were three basic clauses, compromises over slavery, that were essential to coming up with the Constitution. First was the notorious 3/5 clause. You all know remember what the 3/5 clause was, that slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of representation, meaning that southern slaveholding states would have a kind of bonus for their slaves. Slaves weren't going to get to vote. They weren't representing the slaves. They were representing the slaveholders and giving them extra representation. That's what the 3/5 clause was all about. Now, the framers, all of them, agreed that wealth ought to have some weight in representation. They believed in the dominion of property. They were 18th century men. They were not modern Democrats. They believed that wealth ought to count towards representation. And they were bound almost from the beginning to acknowledge the slaveholders' wealth in slaves as long as they acknowledged it as being ratified in state law. They were going to have to give the South some representation for its wealth in slaves. The question was never whether they were going to do it or not. The question was how much. And through very convoluted battles, they settled on the 3/5 formula, which was borrowing from an earlier formula. There's no question that the 3/5 clause expanded the power of the slaveholding South, although it did not give the slaveholders the majority in the new Congress. In fact, the southern slaveholding states would never enjoy a majority in the House of Representatives. They'd have to rely on, Northerners to get their way, which they did. But that's a whole other story. But by adopting the language in that clause, describing the slaves not as property, but as persons, go back and read it again, it's about persons. Persons held to labor or service, not calling them property, not calling them slaves. This is actually, by this point, this was a formula for tolerating or acknowledging slavery without legitimizing it. This was the formula, and they adopted it. By doing that, they deflected any approval of the idea of property in man in the 3/5 clause. Then came the question of the Atlantic slave trade, the big issue. The slaveholders, led by the South Carolinians, no offense to them, it's always the South Carolinians. It's always the South Carolinians. It's been that way since the nation was founded. They made a very big and very successful push to bar any national interference with the slave trade. They actually came up with a draft constitution, a thing called the Committee of Detail, came up with a draft constitution that would have forbidden any interference with the Atlantic slave trade, but any regulation, anything, hands off. Slave trade was the same as slavery as far as they were concerned, and they were not going to allow the federal government any power over the slave trade any more than they would over slavery. But the anti-slavery delegates fought back hard. And they secured the right of the federal government not just to regulate the Atlantic slave trade, but to abolish it. This was precisely what the slaveholders feared the most, was the power of the federal government to abolish the slave trade. Because if they did that, they saw the North was going to have more votes in the Congress. They were going to be able to do this. They were a little bit frightened of it, more than a little bit frightened of it. And indeed, the slaveholders were defeated. The Constitution gave the federal government, Congress, the power to abolish the Atlantic slave trade. Now, Southern politicians being what they are, they managed to outmaneuver the Northerners on many different fronts. And they got a kind of stay of execution for the slave trade, first to 1800 and then to 1808. And that was going to be a big deal down the line. The Southern politicians managed to extract as much out of this as they could. And as we know later on, there were more, South Carolina and Georgia imported more slaves before 1808 in that 20-year period than they did under any previous 20-year period in their existence. So this was going to make a big difference. Nevertheless, they managed to limit slavery, to give the government the power to abolish slavery. And another point in the debates over the so-called Privileges and Immunities Clause, at one point a South Carolinian named Charles Cotesworth Pinckney appeared to try and insert language that would secure slaves as property. The convention overwhelmingly defeated it. South Carolina was the only vote in favor. And finally, the Fugitive Slave Clause. Now, this has an interesting history, it's all in the book, arising wholly from the question of Northern emancipation. The Southerners were only concerned about fugitive slaves because the North was ending slavery. It was a defensive move. They had to make sure that, they were going to hold on. They didn't want their slaves running away to the North to become free. So they come up with the Fugitive Slave Clause, which is actually a pretty weak clause. If you read it, it doesn't empower anybody to do anything. But the convention took very strict steps to make sure that that clause did not validate the idea of property in men. And that's in the book as well. So, unquestionably, the South won victories in Philadelphia in 1787. They helped gain the political initiative over slavery issues that would last for decades. But they did not secure slavery in the Constitution as a national institution, nor did they validate the legitimacy of property in man. Over the next 70 years, that exclusion would be at the heart of the great national and political and constitutional struggles over slavery. Coming out of the ratification debates, anti-slavery Northerners believed that the Constitution gave the federal government expansive power to limit slavery. Southerners fought back hard, and they did very, very well over the next 60 to 70 years. But after 1815, by the force of Northern population growth, giving them more power in the Congress, but also by the rising tide of the anti-slavery movement, the North was to be able to come up with a movement that was going to end up with forming the first great anti-slavery mass organization in world history, the Republican Party. Abraham Lincoln's Republican Party, Frederick Douglass's Republican Party, and change that around. The point being that the Constitution had created a government that was strong enough that it could have great pro-slavery potential, but it could also have great anti-slavery potential. And over the course of history, between 1787 and 1860, finally, after a period of ascendance by the slaveholders, the anti-slavery side won out. And I want to conclude with just a line that kind of backs that all up. From the Constitution on, there was a debate about this. And beginning in around 1815 or so, Southern slaveholders began to claim that the Constitution, in fact, did recognize property in man. There were no records of the Constitution at that point. Madison's notes would not be published until 1840. There was all kinds of precedent about that. They started to say, no, the Fugitive Slave Clause makes slaves into property. Anti-slavery Northerners said, no way. And that was the heart of the fight. Was the Constitution pro-slavery, or did it give the power to the federal government to restrain slavery and slavery's growth, as Lincoln and the Republicans and Douglas said? And it all came down to Lincoln's election in 1860, which led to Southern secession, as we know, precisely on this constitutional issue. For years, decades, the Southerners have been claiming that the Constitution recognized slavery in man, and yet they had to secede. And when they seceded, they formed their own constitution, their own nation, and they formed their own constitution around that nation. And if you read the Confederate Constitution, it's pretty much a copy of the U.S. Constitution, except on all of those issues that I just mentioned about slavery and property. Those are the points where they say that slaves are property. In order to vindicate what they said was the original Constitution, they had to repudiate the original Constitution on the issue of slaves and property. So much so that an Alabama politician named Robert Hardy Smith proclaimed in the aftermath of the formation of the Confederacy, quote, "We have now placed our domestic institution and secured its rights unmistakably in the Confederate Constitution. We have called our Negroes slaves, and we have recognized and protected them as persons and our rights to them as property." That's what the Confederacy was all about. Repudiating what the framers had done. Or at least rewriting what the framers had done. When they couldn't get that rewriting at, then they formed their own country. To secure the Constitution that they had fought for in 1861 required treason in the form of secession. And secession, as the incoming President Abraham Lincoln made clear, meant war. And out of that war came emancipation. Well, that's the story that I have to tell in this book. It's not the usual story, but I think it makes the whole history of the period and the history of slavery more complicated. And things are more complicated, they're usually more interesting. And it makes American history look a lot different than it did. I'm not trying to make people feel better about America than they might have, or worse about America than they might have. But I think that there are contradictions and paradoxes in this story which have to be appreciated if we're to appreciate the fervor of what was going on at this point in history. One last point. I'd also like for people to appreciate that anti-slavery politics was a part of American politics very early on. You know, we tend to assume that anti-slavery only was born with William Lloyd Garrison or the immediatists. That really wasn't true. There was a fight about slavery all throughout. And the anti-slavery people were there. And they were there at the Philadelphia Convention. They didn't always prevail, but they were there. And they prevailed on the one point that really mattered, which was the exclusion of property in man. So with that, I think I'll conclude and look forward to your questions. Thank you. And there are microphones, I believe, at either end, so please step up. Yes, sir.
Hi. My name is Jim Lowen. I'm a sociologist.
Hi.
You are. We've emailed.
Yeah, we have. It's great to meet you at last.
There's a missing guy, maybe even elephant, in your conversation, and he is somebody who just came down in 3 nearby locations. I'm talking about Roger B. Tawney.
Yes.
Because he, in, of course, 1857,
yes,
looks at these founders and he says they had no intention of, and lived in a society that had no intention of giving any rights whatsoever to black people, including any constitutional rights.
Right.
And so I'm wondering how you must talk about him in the book, or if you don't, why not, and how does he fit into this story?
Yes. Oh, no, Roger Tawney is right in the heart of things. Tawney, with the Tawney decision in Dred Scott v. Sanford, basically enshrines, basically makes the Constitution, rewrites the Constitution along the pro-slavery lines. He sees things in the Constitution that just weren't there. But he picks up on the arguments that have been made by the likes of Calhoun and others, going all the way back to the Missouri crisis, and basically says not only that blacks have no rights under the Constitution that white men are bound to respect, but says explicitly that the Constitution recognizes property in man. Mm-hmm. That is the heart of the Dred Scott decision. He made it up. Well, he didn't completely make it up. There was some precedent for all of that. Justice Story and others in other decisions. I won't go into the details, but there was some precedent for that. But what was so alarming to people like Lincoln about the Dred Scott decision was precisely that Tawney had rewritten the Constitution along exactly these lines.
He essentially makes slavery national.
Correct.
Yeah. And one other quick comment.
But let me just, Jim, just quickly. But it's precisely on this question of property in man. That's the issue that's at stake. It had always been at stake. Tawney was the one who made it. Basically, the Southerners were losing the House. They were going to lose the presidency soon enough. They only had the Supreme Court. That's how important the Supreme Court is, folks. But they had the Supreme Court, and they had Tawney, and Tawney gave them what they wanted, what they've been looking for decades. Mm-hmm. Thanks. Over here, yes.
Thank you very much. Absolutely fascinating. Given the large population differences between the slave-owning and non-slave-owning states at the time of the Constitutional Convention, mm-hmm, to what extent was the composition of the Senate and composition of the Electoral Congress a compromise to ensure that going forward the slave-owning states would have advantages in protecting their institution of slavery?
Very much so. Very much so. No, that was there.
Was it part of the conversation? Was it part of the debate?
Absolutely. Especially the Electoral College, which I think was maybe in many ways the slaveholders' greatest victory at the Constitutional Convention. And for that we have to blame James Madison, actually, who was the guy who did all of that. But without question, the North had the preponderance of the population, but there was this gigantic state of Virginia that had that was the most populous state in the country. at that point. Even given the 3/5 clause, the states north of Delaware were going to have an advantage in the House of Representatives, and they were going to control the Senate for a while. There was a thought that the population was moving to the south and the southwest, so that eventually the South would prevail. Some people said 10 years, some people said 50 years, but the idea was eventually that they'd be able to control everything. History turned out just the opposite, right? I mean, you know, northern population vastly outstripped southern population, even with the 3/5 clause. What the 3/5 clause did, though, was to give the South the slaveholders a fighting chance. I mean, it gave them parity. Without the 3/5 clause, the lower South in particular, South Carolina, well, North Carolina sort of, South Carolina and Georgia, would have been an isolated minority. With the 3/5 clause, they had just enough to be able to get their way if they had to, and they did for many decades thereafter. So but that was very much in the thinking. Now, there were those Northerners who didn't want they didn't want the South to get anything. There were lots of Southerners who wanted slaves to be counted 1 to 1, so they'd have even more power. The 3/5 clause ended up being a compromise around all of that, but there's no question that it inflated Southern power. But it didn't secure, even in terms of numbers, did not secure slavery in the Constitution. It sort of left it up to the future.
I found it curious that you mentioned 3 points that were incorporated into the Constitution to protect slavery, but you didn't mention the composition of the Senate or the composition of the Electoral College, which weigh so heavily today.
Absolutely, and the Electoral College, as I say, was fundamental. I mean, Madison looks and says, you know, the Southerners are complaining. Now, the Southerners actually voted against the Electoral College anyway because they were all conservatives and they didn't like the idea of this. They objected for other reasons to it. So they voted against their own interest on slavery on the Electoral College, funnily enough. But, well, not all of them, but in the end. But there's no question that was done precisely to make sure that the Southerners would not be always outvoted for the presidency. It didn't guarantee that a Southern slaveholder would be elected president, but George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, you know, of the first 7 presidents, 5 of them are slaveholders. The Electoral College certainly helped in that regard. So, yeah, I mean, the Southerners got a lot, and representation was part of it. And in the book, I go into the Electoral College much more. I mean, that was a real victory for the slaveholders. They also won another victory over export duties, that you would not be able to tax exports, which the Southerners fought for very hard. They got that one clean. So the Southerners did very well for themselves. And the system that they established was one that was going to permit the South, for a time, to really dominate American politics. But they didn't have that absolute assurance. And that lack of that absolute assurance came back to haunt them after 1815, and that's what undid slavery. So you have a pro-slavery and an anti-slavery constitution kind of in one, and they're both there. And that's it's a paradox that becomes a contradiction that can't hold. I mean, eventually we become a house divided, and we have to have a war over it. But I don't want to minimize in any way the extent to which the Constitutional Convention gave the Southern slaveholders a lot. They did. They won a lot there. And James Madison in particular, we can talk about him later, plays a very cagey role because he plays kind of both sides, depending on what the issue is.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, sure. Sir.
I want to thank you for a very interesting talk, and I always have to say before I start to ask questions that I'm not from the United States. I'm from the Caribbean, and but the issue is that in your talk you don't talk really about the importance of the Caribbean in this whole slavery issue in the United States. You know, some of the early ideas come from the Caribbean. Some of the framing notions come from the Caribbean. And also some of the issues that started out in the Caribbean. I mean, the English getting rid of slavery, I think, is 1835. The French, I come from a small French Dutch island in St. Martin. The French getting rid of slavery in 1848. And the issue is in St. Martin. This is a very interesting idea, right, that the Dutch remained enslaved until 1863. And when the French got rid of slavery in 1848 in St. Martin, basically the entire enslaved Dutch population threatened to move to the French side, and they threw up their hands and said, well, this can't work. Right. But the whole idea of the complexity of property in man. I think another issue here is the fact that although the clearly didn't want to go there and stay that minute property. The issue of how the society, as a free market society, right, the commodification of people and stuff like that, so that although, and the 3/5, right, although you do not want to claim that you're property, you do not want to claim that you're fully human either. So that to a certain extent, then you're still semi-property them. You still turn them into semi-property, right? So that you get this type of thing. Think about the fact that the United States had, from the very beginning, outlawed slavery, right? It would be a totally different society. And how these contradictions continue to haunt the United States at present, right? Very much haunt the United States at present. So that how do you see all of these contradictions continue to play out, and the dangers at this point in time in the North and the West as, racism start to kind of relaunch itself in horrific, ugly ways, both here and in Europe? How do you see all of these different things playing out?
Well,
thank you very much.
That's a lot of questions, good ones. The Caribbean is crucial to all of this. Obviously, I mean, the British slave system is not just North America. More slaves go outside of the North, go to the Caribbean. Saint Domingue and Jamaica, they are the jewels of the slave system as far as the old world is concerned. St. Martin, all the rest, but those two are big. So it's important. And the revolution in Saint Domingue in 1791, just after this, is going to change the question dramatically in the North. So I don't want to take the North American situation and excise it from what's going on elsewhere in the hemisphere. I mean, with a little more time, I'd be able to explain some of the connections, but they're very much there. On the question of commodification, I mean, slavery is the perfect form of human commodification and of subjugation, right? There is no thing more than that. The commodification of labor and so forth, yes, we can talk about that, but it's just fundamentally different to be owned than not to be owned. And it was that was the issue, and it's hard for us to believe or to recognize how much that idea of perfect commodification was taken for granted in the West for so long. Taken for granted. It was okay. It was a natural right. Now, I'm trying to get at that there was a real flashpoint. There's something changed dramatically, and it changed in part because of the French. The British are certainly a part of this as well. There's an international movement, if you will, shift that was going to make slavery, which had been taken for granted for millennia, into something that can no longer be tolerated. The racial aspect of that, though, is going to, it means that you're going to be able to abolish slavery in 1865, but you're not going to be able to abolish racism. And there's nothing in the Constitution that's going to be able to, do that one way or the other. People are then going to have to fight for principles, a more expansive principle of the Constitution. When Jim was talking earlier about Tawney, I mean, Tawney makes it very clear that blacks have no rights, according to the Constitution. Blacks have rights that the white man is bound to respect. Now, that was over-addictive, but still, it's in there. Now, that's an idea that some anti-slavery people actually respected. I mean, if you're anti-slavery, you're not as much of a racist if you're John C. Calhoun. I submit that. If you don't believe that certain orders of human beings are fit for slavery, then you're taking a different position than someone who does. Okay? That's just true. But it doesn't mean that blacks and whites should be equal. Equality is going to be, the dream that's going to be fought over. Now, there is a fight over that, too. I didn't mean to say that there was nothing in that in the North. There was, Reconstruction and so forth. It could have ended differently. We didn't have to be where we are now. We could have ended differently at all sorts of points along the way between 1865 and now. And that's another story. But the legacy of that in current American history is vital. But I come back to another point. Because slavery in the United States was racial slavery, right? I mean, not all blacks were slaves, but all slaves were blacks. Well, Indians as well, but it was racial slavery. It meant that in fighting against slavery, you were bucking a racial order as well. You had to defend the fact that people who had been denigrated to the degree that they were, enslaved on account of their color, of their origin, what have you, nobody deserved that treatment. That was something that was different. The fact that you were black did not mean that you were going to be entitled or you ought to be enslaved. Lots of Americans believed that. And lots of white Americans came not to believe that. And that was a fundamental difference. And that was a position of hope. It didn't guarantee racial equality, but it was the beginnings of something that was different from what had been true since antiquity. Okay? Yes, ma'am.
Given that all 13 original states had slavery, why do you think, or can you speak to why the anti-slavery movement started in the North?
Well, the movement that I talked about was very powerful in the North, in part because of the Quakers. The Quakers had a great deal to do with this. Of the 7 or 8 people who founded the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, most of them were Quakers. And that was a religious element of it. Slavery was less, this is a tough one to state. Slavery was less obviously central to Northern society than it was Southern society. It was but it was still important. It just wasn't the center of, it didn't define society in the way that it did in the South. So that Northerners were able to question it more. But it also had to do with the character of Northern intellectual life during this period. But it's not surprising to me that the South defended slavery as hard as it did. The surprising thing is the North gave it up. You know, there was no reason for them to give it up except for these moral and intellectual and political objections. I mean, you know, slavery wasn't, I mean, people were horrified. It wasn't central to the economy. It was okay. People were making money off of it. People were happy with it. So that's the thing to me. Anti-slavery is not only present, but it really is a radical force. Now, how do we explain the emergence of that kind of radical force at one particular time? That's a big question for all historians, you know, why that would happen. In no small measure, I think, it has to do with pressure from slaves and free blacks. And that's essential to understanding the whole history of anti-slavery throughout. I mean, you can't just throw out white people. You know, there were rebellions. It was becoming very, very clear. And in Massachusetts, there were actually petitions and slave suits. There were white lawyers who were able to help slaves who were claiming their freedom. These were all going on. There's a lot of agitation, you know, at that level that was pushing in the North. You weren't going to find that in South Carolina. You know, you weren't going to find slaves with the ability to do that because they didn't have access to the courts, and you were going to have white lawyers being able to help them out. So the agitation by slaves and free blacks, plus the religious and intellectual questions, I think, make the North, you know, different. But it's still an amazing thing that it happened to me. I mean, you know, I'm more amazed. You know, we look back and we think, how could these people have possibly endorsed slavery? And I get that. It's hard, you know, it's horrifying. And yet at the time, the amazing thing was that anybody was going to object to it. And we have to appreciate that if we're going to understand, you know, the power of this movement. Because this movement did not come naturally. It wasn't, you know, men were not born to think that slavery was a good idea or a bad idea. And for a long time, they believed it was a good idea. Well, that changed. And that change is at the heart of American history. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Thanks for your presentation. My name is Li Yang. I just wonder if we use a concept about productivity product that people produce, but they don't enjoy themselves instead of enjoyed by somebody else, just maybe cause modern slavery, just like recent prison strike. And although we have civil rights, also promote civil rights, and we have 3 branches of government now, maybe have more black people there, but doesn't seem people enjoy their own productivity very much. Instead, it's the other way around. So if this modern slavery is going to go from the beginning of the 18th or 19th century, and now it's getting worse. Now you have everybody, so they lost their productivity, and higher 1% got more enjoyment. Yeah. And now you have a PPP, public-private partnership. If you use example of Rockwell Town Center project, and they don't just utilize general public taxpayers' money, instead they victimize everybody else, and they also rob from the government resources. Yeah. So it's just from the beginning until never end.
Yeah, I mean, the entrenchment of inequality is a constant feature of American history. You know, we're always, the ability of people with power and money and wealth to entrench their power and, you know, inequality and wealth is a constant. Now, some people like to say that America never had a ruling class. The slaveholders were a ruling class in America. Okay, let's go back in history for a second. No question. On the basis of their ownership of other human beings, they not only ran The government, they ran up to Roger Taney at any rate, they ran the courts. They were in charge, even of the country, not only of the South, but of the country. They had entrenched the most, how do we put it, the most radical form of inequality. The most radical form, which is the ability of one person to own another. Now, the end of that, though, did not end the battle of the entrenchment of privilege and of inequality. Not by a long shot. The racial aspects of it are there, but there are many, many others. What I'm interested in, I suppose, is how certain Americans managed to entrench their power, entrench their privilege so that it seems natural to everybody else. That's the question. I mean, people go around saying today, inequality, well, you know, people don't work hard enough. They should get, you know, they should be doing better. Or those lazy so-and-sos, you know, they're never going to get. That's crazy. Because inequality is inscribed in law. Inequality is inscribed in politics. But the ability of those who are entrenched to persuade other people that inequality, that they deserve their inequality. That they deserve to be where they are. That's the natural order of things. That is a constant fight in America, to me. I'm not sure if I'm getting all of your question right, but that to me is something that this is part of. This story is part of that, but it's not the whole story. It's a friend of mine, a colleague of mine at Princeton, Paul Starr, is writing a book precisely about this question of entrenchment of privilege and power, and he has a whole chapter on slavery. And slavery is a crucial chapter in that book, and to the extent that racism, you know, that was associated with slavery, has now become another way to persuade people that they deserve the inequality that they get, which it does. It's only part of this larger story, the history that I'm talking about.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sir.
I just want to comment that I think you may be giving Madison a break here. We had
I was giving him a hard deal, but okay, go ahead.
Well, when you said that he stated that the Constitution should not legitimize property in man.
Right.
And we had a speaker speaking right from your dais, I believe her name was Sarah Bilder.
Sarah, yes.
Who wrote a book, Madison's Hand, did a detailed study of the notes that Madison took and how it was not all written at the same time.
Yes.
Much was written after. And her book argues that Madison was a big defender of the slave interest throughout the convention, wanted the 3/5 clause applied to the Senate, and however, added that anti-slavery comment when he revised the notes after the Bill of Rights had been adopted and the Constitution had been ratified, and probably, in her view, never said on the convention floor that comment. Right. Could you comment on her views?
Yeah, sure. Well, I actually go into Professor Bilder, who's a great scholar, and who I admire enormously, in the book. And Madison plays it both ways. Madison, yes, on the Electoral College, in all sorts of ways, he is defending the slaveholders, but not on the slave trade.
Okay.
The Virginians divide from the lower South on the slave trade. And that's really the longest argument over slavery at the convention is on the slave trade. And it's in the midst of that debate that particular line comes up. Now, I've read through Sarah's book very carefully. There is a line that he probably added later, but it's not that line.
I see.
That line he probably said. It doesn't make sense that he wouldn't have said it in quite the way that he did. I have to go back and check. I want to, since this is being taped, I don't want to say anything that's not true. I'll go back and remind myself exactly what he said.
I have to do the same.
What he said and what he didn't say. But nevertheless, I think he's playing a double game. It's clear in that particular instance that they have to go back and take out some language which would have implied that there would have been property in man. I'm pretty sure that that's something that Madison would have gone along with because the entire convention the majority of the convention believed that. And particularly in the context of the Atlantic slave trade debate, It made sense for Madison to say that. That's not saying that he was some great anti-slavery guy, not by any means. In his other notes, he doesn't like slavery very much. The question of Atlantic slave trade, though, he doesn't want it extended. You know, he's willing to go to 1800. He doesn't like that it's going to go to 1808, and he objects, and that's where he says this.
Well, he doesn't want that clause in there at all, as I recall.
He wants Congress to have the authority to abolish the slave trade.
Well,
no question.
Perhaps we both ought to look at that again, because
Yeah.
my recollection is he didn't object horribly to the clause, but he said that if you're going to put it off for 20 years, you might as well make it forever.
Okay.
And so he voted against it on that ground.
On this, I'm very clear. Madison did want to give Congress the authority. He was on the committee, in fact, that decided this.
Right.
He did want to give them the ability. He was willing to go to 1800, but he didn't want it. Then there's a moment in the convention where Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, the South Carolinian, managed to get it extended to 1808, and he's in alliance with certain New Englanders. And Madison objects at that point. Now, it's unclear whether Madison's comments then were said. You know, Sarah makes a very good point that that's not. But it doesn't make sense any other way. He would have objected to that extension to 1808 because he did want to see the slave trade ended. You know, and he feared that extending it to 1808 would do exactly what in fact happened. Now, whether he said it or not, we don't know.
But of course, Virginia had a lot of slaves to sell to other states.
Yeah, that's what the South Carolinians always said. They said, these Virginians, they're just a bunch of, you know, slaveholders who want to make a lot of money. Well, the fact was that the Virginians have been addicted to the slave trade for a very long time. I mean, George Mason, who gives the big, strong anti-slave trade speech at the convention of Virginia, had been saying this long before the issue came up about selling slaves elsewhere, the domestic slave trade argument. There was a real, genuine humanitarian argument against the slave trade, and the Virginians held to it. The fact that they were going to make some money off the side, that didn't hurt, but I don't think that was the primary thrust of it. The South Carolinians always said, those Virginians, they just want to make money. They don't have any humanity to them. I tend to believe the Virginians more than I do the rather cynical South Carolinians, but maybe that's my own prejudice. Okay. But we should go back and figure. It's all in, my version of that is in my book, so I'll rely on that.
Okay.
Anything I said in the last 10 minutes that's inaccurate, I apologize.
Sean, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Folks, just a reminder, there's a book signing one level up at the Archives bookstore. We will meet you up there in just a few moments.